With that, we'll begin with the opening statements. Mr. Graham, you're up, and I'll start the clock when you begin speaking.
Okay, tonight I would like to thank Southern Evangelical Seminary's Philosophy Club for sponsoring this debate, and I'd like to thank Mr. Matthew Nadler for agreeing to debate this important topic. Tonight's question is, are moral principles objective or subjective? And speaking of morals as objective, I simply mean that morals are discovered by man, not created by man. By calling morals subjective, I refer to the notion that morals are creations of man. My argument will have 4 steps. First, I want to describe the empirical reality that both of us have to explain. Next, I want to explain how it is that I will argue for the objectivity of morals. After that, I want to show that given the nature of this empirical reality, people really believe that morals are objective. Finally, I want to argue that given the nature of this empirical reality, people are correct in thinking that morals are objective. It's important to realize that I am not saying that one step logically follows from the other step. These steps are primarily for organizational purposes, and each point will be elaborated on and defended separately. So my first step. Step 1 is the thing to be explained. To begin, I want to briefly discuss the empirical reality that both of us are going to explain. When we argue about the nature of morality, we need to have a reference point for our argumentation. We need to have some kind of thing that we can point to and say, yes, this view best explains those facts. Even if your reason for accepting one explanation over another is intuitive or subjective, the thing to be explained is itself available for all of us to see. Our starting point tonight is the fact of moral experience. Both of us must give an account of the fact that humans continually make evaluative statements that are moral in nature. Both of us must explain the human inclination to judge a thing or act as good and bad. Every day in every inhabited location on earth, people are making moral judgments about things and actions. We say that Bill was wrong for cheating on his wife. We give Mother Teresa high esteem and honor for her humanitarian work in India. Many people judge the actions of President Bush to be immoral, and they use inflammatory rhetoric to show the extent of their moral disapproval. These kinds of inclinations and judgments are undeniable. Not even the noted subjectivist Friedrich Nietzsche denies that people make moral evaluations. Like everyone else, he sees moral judgments as some things that require some kind of explanation. So while he explicitly denies that morals are objective, Nietzsche does not go so far as to espouse the absurd idea that people do not make moral evaluations. Likewise, philosopher Bertrand Russell recognizes the need to explain moral judgments. In his book, Elements of Ethics, Russell espouses an objectivist view of ethics, but later he espouses a form of subjectivism. However, even with this radical change in his moral philosophy, he still did not deny the fact of moral judgments. Rather, he reinterpreted his moral experience in light of his metaphysical commitments. So here again, we have a subjectivist who acknowledges the fact of moral judgments. I don't want to belabor this point. Suffice it to say, the fact of moral experience is something we may both grant and move on to explain in our respective ways. That people make evaluative judgments that are moral in nature is the reason why there's a philosophical discipline called ethics in the first place. Okay, so step 2. Step 2 is, how will I argue for the objectivity of morals? Now, it might be asked, obviously, how in the world do you intend to prove that morals are objective from the mere fact of moral judgments? After all, isn't the attempt to prove an ought from an is futile? Did I learn nothing from David Hume or G.E. Moore? Well, to avoid confusion, I need to clarify my approach here. I will not be arguing that we can arrive at the conclusion you ought not to kill people from the observation of one person killing another person. Nor will I be arguing directly against Moore's position, that the good cannot be identified with anything natural. To argue in the former way is to commit the is-ought fallacy, and to argue in the latter way is to take us away from the subject at hand. Rather, tonight I will be arguing by way of an inference to the best explanation. In other words, given the spectrum of moral experience, objectivism offers the most satisfying explanation of the facts that we observe. In a moment, I will argue that we really do believe that morals are objective. As I go through those arguments, subjectivists in the crowd will probably be thinking, it doesn't matter if everyone in the world believed that morals are objective. That doesn't prove that they really are objective. But if you're thinking that, you're going to miss the point of my next step. My next point is simply that people believe that morals are objective. I want to establish that people believe morals are objective, not because I think it proves that morals are in fact objective, but because I think it strengthens my argument that objectivism best explains the fact of moral judgments. So I fully recognize that subjectivists have an explanation for why people believe that morals are objective. However, it is my contention that those explanations are not good explanations. So step 3, that people believe that morals are objective. I have 3 short arguments for the conclusion that people believe morals are objective. Okay, this is by no means an exhaustive list of arguments, it's just a sampling. Argument 1 is an argument from the use of moral language. One clue to what we believe about the nature of morality may be taken from the way we talk about right and wrong. The fact that we vigorously express our approval and disapproval of others is something with which we are all well acquainted. For example, a coworker may say something like, "Jim is doing a horrible job of running this company. If he wanted to make things better around here, he should treat his people with more respect." Or you may hear someone in the news say something like, "I can't believe they let that guy out of jail. They should have let him fry in the electric chair." Words like should and ought are commonplace in our everyday conversation. In fact, a large number of us spend more time talking about the way things ought to be than the way things are. The natural distinction between what is the case and what ought to be the case is among the most obvious distinctions we know. We don't simply describe the physical world, we evaluate the world. Some of those evaluations are what we would call moral evaluations. For example, consider the following 2 statements. 1, Jesus was a good man. 2, Hitler was an evil man. The subjectivist would have you believe that our moral claims refer to our own feelings or attitudes about something, so that when you say Jesus was a good man, what you're really doing is saying, I like Jesus in a sort of universalized form. When you say Hitler was an evil man, you are really expressing your negative feelings or attitudes about Hitler in an inaccurate way. So in effect, the subjectivist is saying that moral claims are either identical with or reducible to personal feelings or attitudes. In essence, they are saying that the statement, Jesus was a good man, is identical with or reducible to the statement, I like Jesus. The objectivist, on the other hand, maintains that moral claims are different from sentimental claims. On the objectivist account of morals, to say Jesus was a good man is not to say I like Jesus, nor is it reducible to the claim I like Jesus. Rather, for the objectivist, good is really a predicate of the subject. In other words, we are saying something which we believe is true of Jesus, namely that he is good. When we are not speaking of our personal feelings about Jesus, even though feelings may arise because of our moral commendation of him. Besides, if we wanted to convey something about our personal feelings about Jesus, we could do that. Our language is more than adequate to convey thoughts about our personal feelings. However, even though our language can easily accommodate descriptions of our subjective states, statements that predicate moral attributes or qualities of subjects are still used with great regularity. The fact that ordinary people believe that they're making objective claims when they use moral language is something that even subjectivist J.L. Mackie admits. In his book, Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, he says, the ordinary user of moral language means to say something about whatever it is that he characterizes morally. For example, a possible action as it is in itself, or would be if it were realized, and not about or even simply expressive of his or anyone else's attitude or relation to it. But the something that he wants to say is not purely descriptive, but something that involves a call for action, or for the refraining from action, and one that is absolute, not contingent upon any desire or preference or policy or choice, his own or anyone else's. In other words, Mackie admits that the normal user of moral language thinks that his or her claims are in fact objective. So rather than denying the obvious common use of moral language, Mackie and other subjectivists focus their attention on second-order questions. They know the sentence, Jesus is a good man, is an indicative statement that is usually intended to serve an informative function. Rather, their approach is to deny that these kinds of sentences are informative of any extra mental reality. Argument 2, argument from the offering of reasons for moral positions. One thing that is conspicuous about moral discourse is that we habitually offer reasons for our moral positions. When we are asked about our moral stance on an issue, we often appeal to a more general principle for that position. For example, if I were to ask someone, why is fraud wrong? They would probably respond by saying, because it's the intentional misleading of an individual. If I were to persist with my questioning and ask, well, why is that wrong? They might respond, well, it's because it's wrong to lie. What this person has done reveals that they believe that reasons, rather than mere causes, may be given to justify a moral position. In other words, rather than giving an account of their psychological tendencies, coupled with their biological predispositions, they offer rational reasons for their moral position. So to offer reasons for a position is to presuppose that a position is rational. If rational reasons may be given for moral positions, then we are, by the very use of rational argumentation, implying the objectivity of morals. When you offer reasons for a position, you are assuming a logical relationship between your premises and your conclusion. In the above example, the individual answering my questions has unwittingly put together a practical syllogism. He has, in effect, organized the premises in the following way. 1, it is wrong to lie. 2, fraud is a form of lying, and therefore fraud is wrong. Okay? The fact that we see a logical relationship between basic moral principles and specific moral conclusions may be seen in government all the time. Members of Congress spend all of their time arguing about what people should and should not be able to do. They argue about which people ought to get what resources. And they argue about whether or not we ought to be in Iraq. All of this arguing supposes that there's something about which to argue. Okay? Argument 3, argument from the distinction between power and legitimate authority. A further evidence for the notion that we believe in the objectivity of morals comes from the distinction we make between power and legitimate authority. For as long as society has been around, there have been groups of people who have ruled over other groups of people. That some groups are accepted as legitimate authorities and others are rejected as illegitimate rogue regimes suggests that people do not accept power as a sufficient condition for legitimacy. It seems that for any authority to be legitimate, that authority must exist to produce some good end. This is a necessary condition, though not necessarily sufficient condition, for an authority to be considered legitimate. Now, the cynic might respond and say that the fact that one group always rules over another group is simply due to reoccurring power struggles. Accordingly, various factions of people are always striving for power, and some simply win the battle and others lose the battle. To the cynic, those individuals in government are simply the ones that won the battle. This view basically equates government with the biggest gang on the block. They are in power simply because they are more powerful. More commonly, however, people are able to see an important distinction between, say, a police officer and a gang member. We understand that a gang member may have power over an individual and that he may be able to make someone do something against their will. But we do not consider a gang member to be a legitimate authority over us. The police officer, however, has the power to restrain people and put them in jail against their will, but this power is acceptable because we see the police officers having a legitimate right to use power. At least part of that legitimacy comes from the fact that we know police officers have a good end or purpose, namely to protect and keep the peace. What we see is that on some level, authority requires as a necessary condition some objectively good end in order for it to rise to the level of legitimate authority. Governments must protect people, not enslave them, because protecting people is really good and enslaving people is really an evil. Likewise, intellectual authorities ought to have truth and propagate it to those who learn from them because truth is really good and ignorance really an evil. Authority, then, is only possible if goodness is something with which may be known and attained. In fact, that people recognize this when they obey legitimate authorities suggests that on some level, people recognize that some powers exist to promote good ends. If we didn't think that some ends were really good and others were really bad, then we would have no basis for the distinction between power and legitimate authority. Yet the distinction persists, so it seems that people do think that some things are really good and some things are really bad. Okay, and this is my fourth now and final step, that we're correct in thinking that morals are objective. Obviously, the most important part. But before I begin this step, let me summarize what I've just done. First, I have framed the debate so as to require both of us to explain the very real and prevalent fact that humans make moral evaluations. Next, I said that my argument would be an inference to the best explanation. In other words, I said that I would offer objectivism as a theory that best explains the facts of moral experience. After that, I offered 3 arguments in support of the notion that on some level, we believe that morals are objective. Now I want to argue that we are correct in thinking that morals are objective. So what I need to do is show why I think objectivism best explains the fact that people make moral evaluations and that this theory is better in helping us understand actual moral experiences that we encounter in everyday life. I don't have much time left, but allow me to give a few examples of the deficiency of subjectivism and the superior explanatory power of objectivism. So let's contrast the views. First, objectivism takes as natural the distinction between what is the case and what ought to be the case. In contrast to subjectivism, many objectivist theories think that people make the distinction between is and ought because reality is such that it imposes the distinction on us. So while the subjectivist takes the distinction to be a strange, irrational feature of our psychology, the objectivist may take the distinction as a natural one, which better accounts for its overwhelming prevalence. Subjectivism, on the other hand, collapses this distinction. As A.J. Ayer notes, we are inquiring whether statements of ethical value can be translated into statements of empirical fact. That can be so translated is the contention of those ethical philosophers who are commonly called subjectivists. The subjectivists, if they are correct, it would follow that ethical assertions are not generically different from factual assertions, which are ordinarily contrasted with them. So in collapsing the distinction between is and ought, the subjectivist abandons any rational means of explaining why people make this distinction in everyday life. Because they don't take the distinction as natural, they end up being left with a very short list of possible causes that may account for it. For the subjectivist, it is simply a brute fact that psychology can explain why people mistakenly distinguish between is and ought. More specifically, for them, it is a brute fact that feelings or sentiments account for this vast range of moral experience. Consider the fact that people offer rational reasons for their moral positions. On the subjectivist account, when people think they are being rational and offering reasons for their moral positions, the subjectivist says, you're not really being rational, you're just universalizing your feelings. This point is bluntly made by J.L. Mackie. He says, the denial of objective values will have to be put forward not as the result of an analytic approach, but as an error theory. A theory that although most people in making judgments implicitly claim, among other things, to be pointing to something objectively prescriptive, they are all false, or these claims are all false. So again, the explanation for the widespread epidemic of offering rational reasons for moral positions is explained by sentiment. What, on the subjectivist account, explains the widespread acceptance of the distinction between power and legitimate authority? As you might expect, sentiment accounts for this. What nuanced account does the subjectivist give for our feeling guilty for committing actions that violate our conscience? Once again, feelings account for guilty feelings. What else do sentiments account for? They account for why we have a sense of obligation, even in the absence of social pressure. They account for why we can't avoid making moral evaluations. They account for why we get so upset at others when they do things that we don't think are right, etc., etc. This theory starts to smack of a sort of sentiments of the gaps theory. Sentiments explain everything. And why must they bear the burden of explaining everything? Usually it's because subjectivists are unwilling to consider a more robust metaphysical system. In Mackie's case, it's because he thinks that moral predicates, can only refer to strange and mysterious entities. In other words, Mackie can't come up with a clear and distinct feature of reality to which moral predicates refer. And from that, he concludes that there can't possibly be any objective basis for morals, hence his subjectivism. In contrast, many objectivist theories, particularly those within the natural law tradition, offer integrated ontological, epistemological, and psychological accounts of the human inclination to evaluate the world in moral terms. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to give you a full picture of the natural law theory of morality, but let me give you a taste. Many natural law theorists offer human nature as the proximate ground for morality and God as the ultimate ground. They can offer human nature as the ground for morality because their metaphysics and epistemology accounts for such a view. For example, unlike Hume and others of his time, natural law theorists typically don't view sense experience as a thin thing. For them, there is more to sense data than the data of sense. There is intelligibility built into the very structure of reality. More than just the data of sense comes to us through our senses. This is important. This epistemology, which I have not even begun to elaborate on, allows for a metaphysical knowledge. We can know what things are, and in knowing what things are, we can know something about the thing's natural end, and in what perfects that thing. In knowing what perfects a thing, we can know what is good for that thing, and in knowing what is good for that thing, we can recognize a privation of that good. That privation is what we call evil. If what natural law theorists is saying is true, it makes sense of a vast range of moral experiences. For example, we feel obligation because we really are naturally inclined to a good end, and when we don't attain that good, we become psychologically distraught. 2, we argue about morals because we think people are right and other people are wrong. If objectivism is true, then our arguing accords with reality. We are arguing for a position because we know that some moral views are correct and others are incorrect. We distinguish between is and ought because our natures point us to what we ought to be. But due to laziness, weakness of will, etc., we don't always live up to that standard. We build a system of laws and enforce them on populations because we think those laws will help us to avoid certain evils, such as the evil of anarchy, or at least evils that come from anarchy. So I can go on and on with examples of how objectivism squares with our experience and how subjectivism simply reinterprets our experience with overly simple answers. So again, it is my contention that objectivism better explains moral experience. For now, I will wait to hear Mr. Nadler's case, and then we can continue the discussion from there.
Mr. Nadler, I'll start the time when you start talking.
Thank you, Mr. Graham, for that excellent presentation and for suggesting this topic, and to the Philosophy Club for opening up this forum. My task is to persuade you that moral values are subjective. This means, of course, that there are no objective moral values, and also it includes a recognition that we construct moral values, At the risk of oversimplifying, we say that to call something objective means it derives its truth from some public data, or is publicly determined, or better, as Mr. Graham seems to prefer, that they're discovered, he says, on that basis. If something is subjective, on the other hand, it derives from private data, or is privately determined. The difference here between objective and subjective also implies a difference in metaphysical status, in that if objective, moral values somehow have a mind-independent status, existing in the mind and also outside the mind, whereas if subjective, their status is mind-dependent, that is, existing in the mind alone. If subjective, we are responsible for our own ethics, in that we are the author of whatever ethics may exist. There are three things that I want you to take away from my opening statement. The first is an important clarifying point on what my position really concerns, whereas the second and third will be arguments for that position. One, my position concerns the grounds of moral values, not their content, and I'm going to explain that. Two, divergent moralities seem to stem from differing ways of life, not a common law. And three, if objective, moral values have to be something deeply strange, that is inconsistent with the world. From these 3 points, we will see that what Matthew Graham has aptly described as the fact of moral experience does not require any objective ground to legitimate it. A better explanation is that morals are subjective. My first point, my position concerns the grounds of moral values, not their content. Usually the reason why people are against subjectivism is because they think it's going to destroy or ruin morality as such. And by that, they usually mean their own moral outlook. This is why we must make a distinction here between grounds and content of morality. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about from the arts. In music, discussion or debate on content would be about particular songs or melodies, rhythms, and so forth of perhaps your favorite Beach Boys tune or whatnot. But if we were talking about the grounds of music, that is, what makes music what it is, it would not be a discussion of some set of particular tunes, but rather we would be speaking of what it means for the art itself to exist, in what way it exists, and so forth. Or for another example from science, take physics. The content of physics is its laws, its theories, and also its particular experiments, and so forth. Whereas a debate on the grounds or nature of physics would not include its particular laws necessarily, but would rather be what it means to know a being as physical, or what it means to be a physical being, or something like this. Let's shift back now to ethics or morality. The content of morality is its various laws and people's behavior with respect to those laws. But our debate concerns its grounds. My conclusions, if correct, need not ruin or change your morality or your understanding of the content of morality or what moral behavior consists in. It was Nietzsche, in fact, who commented in his book Daybreak that when man gave all things a sex, he thought not that he was playing, but that he had gained a profound insight. In the same way, man has ascribed to all that exists a connection with morality and laid an ethical significance on the world's back. One day this will have as much value and no more as what the belief in the masculinity or femininity of the sun has today. He seems to be saying that you should treat the traditional ascriptions of morality as irrelevant and adopt a different moral outlook. That's Nietzsche's opinion, and neither its rightness nor wrongness has any effect on our debate. This is because to reject the morality of tradition and recommend that others do the same is to talk about the content of ethics, not whether moral values are themselves objective or subjective. That is, it may be consistent to be a subjectivist and nevertheless maintain a traditional, conventional, even conservative morality. Conversely, it may be possible to be an objectivist and to maintain that is objectively the case, for example, that everyone should do whatever he feels like. So now on to my first point. That is my first point, rather, that subjectivism, in the sense we're talking about, concerns the grounds of moral values, not their content. My second point, in arguing for my position, that divergent moralities stem from different ways of life, not an objective common law. It's a fact that there exists a multiplicity of differing standards of morality. In some cultures, it's considered wrong to smoke or drink. In others, it's expected. In some cultures, infanticide is considered a grave evil, and in others, for example, the Inuit culture, it was for a long time a part of the culture. And in some cultures, monogamy is the norm, polygamy forbidden, whereas in other cultures, polygamy is the norm and monogamy forbidden. I don't need to necessarily go on. Now, we should note that disagreement does not in itself mitigate against moral values being objective. I readily grant that disagreement can occur on matters which I think we should all allow as having an objective ground. This is the case, for example, in history or in the physical sciences. Yet in those fields, disagreement stems primarily from inadequate evidence. To focus on history, no one argues, or at least no one should argue, I don't think, that past events did not take place, or that they took place in people's minds, or that they did not take place, in other words, in some real objective sense. But nevertheless, we clearly cannot know everything about the past. What we do know is only from varied accounts and reports, and this limited evidence, it's this limited evidence which often gives rise to disagreement. By contrast, disagreement about moral codes seems not only to reflect, but stem from different people's adherence to and participation in varying ways of life. Hence, it's not quite so apparent that objectivism can simply be presumed in light of this difference. For example, we all know some peoples that approve of monogamy and disapprove of polygamy, where there are other peoples where the opposite is true. It seems implausible to suggest that the polygamy of one people, the monogamy of the other, or perhaps the customs of both, are confusions or degradations of some original code, which may or may not be reflected in any particular culture. The hypothesis, on the other hand, that they reflect the ways of life of the particular culture, conventionalized as custom, and then objectified into law, explains the moral diversity within cultures. Thus, we have a reason to favor subjectivism as a simpler hypothesis, which explains the necessary data. So it seems that the facts on the ground so far speak against objectivism and also in favor of subjectivism. For if one is faced with conflicting reports of public data stemming from different cultures, or even from within one specific culture, and there's no public means of adjudicating between them, then it follows that he or she should look elsewhere. So, to recap, so far I've explained that my position concerns the grounds of moral values, not their content. And also, I've stated that divergent moralities stem from differing ways of life, not an objective moral law. Finally, my final point. If objective, moral values would have to be something deeply strange, or queer. Mackie calls it queer. And that's my final point. When I say something strange, I mean that it doesn't belong. That is, you have one cow is white, another's brown, and the other one sings opera and cooks Thai food. The last cow is strange, okay? It's inconsistent with the world. If there were objective moral values, these would be very strange objects, and to know them as objective features of the world would be equally strange. This status, if I'm correct, should indicate to us not merely that objectivism is a difficult position to hold. Rather, giving a normal way of viewing the world, it indicates that objectivism is false. One sense in which they would be strange is as prescriptive objects, that is, prescriptive objects. They would be objects that command us to do something, or even impel us to do something. Merely having that object would be, independently of ourselves, reason for anyone to act in some particular fashion. J.L. Mackie, who my opponent has already referred to, points out that that Plato's forms, the Platonic world of heaven of forms, were meant to serve just a function in his metaphysics. They give a dramatic picture of what objective values would have to be. The form of the good is such that knowledge of it provides the knower with both a direction and an overriding motive. Something's being good both tells the person who knows this to pursue it and makes him do so. An objective good would be sought by anyone who was acquainted with it, not because of any contingent fact that this person or every person is so constituted that he desires this end, but just because this end has to-be-pursuedness built into it, end quote. Whatever these objective moral values would have to be, again, they must have a quality which Mackie calls to-be-pursuedness. That is, a quality that's also mind-independent. But the existence of such beings are in no way observed, at least not normally. This brings us to our first argument. Our moral values purport to refer to intrinsically prescriptive properties and facts, so that if there were any objective moral values, they would have to be intrinsically prescriptive. Yet, to be intrinsically prescriptive is inconsistent with the world as we observe it. Therefore, if there were any objective moral values, they would be inconsistent with the world as we observe it. A second way in which objective moral values are inconsistent with the world focuses on the necessary connection there would have to be between is and ought in morality. And contrary to what has been claimed about my position, I do not collapse the distinction. In fact, this distinction is very important for my reasons for rejecting objectivism, which I'd like to explain. Let's consider an act of deliberate cruelty, say, torturing people for fun. First, we need to distinguish between two statements. First, we have the descriptive fact with which we all would most likely agree, that torturing people for fun is a deliberate act of cruelty. Or, upon observing such an act, we may proclaim, lo and behold, an act of deliberate cruelty. But what is relevant to our discussion is not this mere factual description of such torture as an act of deliberate cruelty, but rather a moral valuation of it, which, again, all of us would most likely agree. That is, torturing people for fun is wrong. Or, upon observing it, we may make the moral evaluation and say, this is wrong. That is, upon seeing it. Now, the question is, what is the relation between the natural fact, torturing people for fun is an act of deliberate cruelty, that can be observed, and the moral value, torturing people for fun is wrong? Or taking the more general statements, as I had said them, what is the relation between the observation that this act is an act of deliberate cruelty, or the moral value, this is wrong? Surely it isn't mere logical entailment. That is to say, the predicate of one is not included in the predicate of the other, such that it's simply logically true. Nor is it merely that these features simply occur together, because that wouldn't tell us anything then about the morality of the act. Rather, the objectivist would have to say that, as he has, that this is wrong because it has that feature, that there's some sort of consequential link between the two. But what in the world is this feature? What is the meaning of this word because in that statement? What is it referring to? It demands explanation, yet the natural world offers us none. There would simply be this mysterious link between the two, that is, between the natural fact that torturing people for fun is an act of deliberate cruelty and the moral valuation that torturing people for fun is wrong. The upshot of this is that the real distinction between is and ought shows us that the moral quality is derivable from the natural fact. And this is extremely significant. In an objectivist universe, the moral ought in some way supervenes or hangs over the factual is, but it doesn't show up in the act itself. It simply hangs over it without explanation. On the other hand, in a subjectivist world, moral oughts are well accounted for. They're constructed by us. Now, especially because of the sort of strength of the example I just gave, torturing people for fun, you may be concerned that this somehow undercuts the wrongness of torturing people for fun. I mean, it seems very obvious to us that torturing people for fun is wrong. And if I've undercut that in some way, then we have a problem. But does it? Does it rather not put it on its proper ground? That is, the subjects who created the value in the first place to meet their own needs, ends, and wants? Indeed, it would seem that rather to posit an objective moral value when such entities are inconsistent with the world is to undercut the wrongness of torturing people for fun. So to sum up this half of the argument, objectivism must posit a relation in the world between objective moral values and the facts of some act which are taken to be moral or immoral. Yet such a relation has no natural explanation. Therefore, objectivism posits moral entities that are completely without explanation, that is, they're metaphysically queer. These are just a couple ways in which moral values turn out to be quite strange things in an objectivist world. So to sum up my position concerns the grounds of moral values, not their content. Divergent moralities stem from differing ways of life, not a common law. And if objective, moral values would have to be something deeply strange that is inconsistent with the world. And in light of the evidence, I think we are warranted to conclude that moral values are in fact subjective. Thanks.
That's been our opening statement segment. We'll now go to the rebuttals. During the rebuttal time, each debater will have 10 minutes. During this time, each debater will not offer any new arguments, but will spend their entire time responding only to their opponent's arguments. Because Matt Graham went first in the opening statement time, Matt Nadler will go first in the rebuttal. Matt, I'll start time when you begin speaking.
Thanks. First of all, I thought it was an excellent presentation by Mr. Graham. I thought he covered the issues in a way that was challenging to my view. That being, and especially part one was helpful. I think I found basically everything within it I found agreeable, not much to dispute. I agree that moral experience, the fact of moral experience, is what needs to be explained. It seems that what I am doing is emphasizing that it's people who experience it, and that, in fact, the experience, some things are experienced because they derive from the people who experience it. But that said, I don't have any qualms with Mr. Graham's assertions in this section. In part two, Mr. Graham stated that objectivism, or rather the argument for objectivism, is an inference to the best explanation. I believe that's what you said. And indeed, it seems clear that to deduce the objectivity of values is impossible. So I think he actually made a good move there. Yet, there's something curious about this idea of an inference to the best explanation. Such an inference seems to need criteria for preferring one explanation to another. When it comes down to it, I'm not sure what those criteria are. What are the actual criteria by which objectivism is supposed to be a preferable explanation to subjectivism? And I'm going to retouch this issue when we get to part 4, which is obviously the most important. And as far as I could tell, also parts 3 and 4 were joined together in an intimate way, because the ideas in part 3 became, as he said, the basis for strengthening the conclusions of part 4. And one thing he introduced, an idea he introduced in part 3, was when he was going over the reasons why we believe moral values are objective, was I think he made some statements about subjectivism which I need to challenge, which I think were not quite accurate. He says that the subjectivist, all he can do is explain away moral values as mere feelings, that he has to reduce, as it were, moral values to feelings. This is not the case. Moral values are not mere feelings. Now, it needs to be stated that there's something called the pathetic fallacy. It doesn't mean you're just a sad person. But the pathetic fallacy, Hume calls it the mind's propensity to spread itself on external objects. And I believe that's at work in our tendency to objectify moral values, that is, to take things which are inherently subjective and make them objective. That is, to some degree, an individual might project his feelings onto an objective act while moralizing. Far from being an ad hoc assessment, I think that's perfectly understandable. I think we can all imagine times in which we've seen people who are sort of objectivizing their feelings in cases where there's not an objective moral value. There's no moral value there that you would agree with. For example, when people are criticizing evangelicals for whatever, oftentimes they're working from their own feelings based in their disagreement with you. And so I don't think the projection of feelings can be completely dismissed. But it's important to realize that subjectivism is not compelled to consider your feelings as your feelings, that is, your personal feelings, as the basis for your moral values. Even in part, you can have no feelings whatsoever. There may be no derivation whatsoever of your own values from any attitudes that you may happen to have. We each receive, in large part, the morality of our culture, the morality of our religion, of our family, and so forth. We are all socialized into a particular moral outlook that was objectified long ago. One indeed may follow a morality of his culture against his personal attitude or preference, hence considering himself moral, just not feeling good, perhaps. When we speak of personal attitude as the basis of morality, we are considering the primordial basis of morality, which is already, for the most part, objectified in various cultures. This seems to account quite well for moral experience as we have it, in a manner consistent with science, disregarding my opponent's desire for fattened, or, if you prefer, robust metaphysics. In any case, at the primordial level, it's not just feelings at work either. It would be quite misleading if we were to attempt to explain all morals to feelings alone. With feelings alone, sorry. We also must attempt to take into account the wants, needs, and desires of individuals which are at work. Hence, things are good in the sense of being desired by persons. And then later, they're good in the sense of having an objective moral good attached to them. That is, they're objectified within a culture, considered good as part of the society's norms. When all this is taken into consideration, I think the theory is not only to be considered coherent, but also to fully explain morality. Now, he also spoke about the fact that we're unable to universalize morality, or rather unable to deal with the fact that we give reasons. But indeed, the fact that we universalize any moral value which we happen to have, I think explains very well our practice of giving reasons for morality. Because that's just a facet of morals as we have them, that they are universalizable. That it doesn't say to one way or the other whether they're from sentiment or from will or from some sort of objective moral value that you have to posit. Rather, an individual in a certain situation in which he has to make a decision, even not considering the morality he's received from religion, culture, if he was just making a decision on the fly, as it will, he would be universalizing his sentiments, indeed, but in that universalization, he could give reasons. For example, if you see someone in a ditch, you might think to yourself, well, okay, I don't want to help him because I'm in a hurry. But you may then also think to yourself, but what about when I'm in a ditch? In other words, is it reasonable for me to assume that what I want to do can be universalized in such a way that the person in the ditch, if it was me, would then also get what I want? And so in that, it's nevertheless subjective, but universalized. And so you've given a reason for it. That's just one example, and it's obviously a sort of ad hoc example, admittedly, but it's an example of how one can give reasons in a subjectivist account. reasons are perfectly normal, perfectly at home, if you will. Finally, not finally, I have at least two more points. He claims that subjectivism collapses the distinction between is and ought. As I explained, we don't do this. Now, A.J. Ayer may be doing this, but I'm not an emotivist. I don't hold to that particular brand of subjective morality. Ought statements are demands required from some person, and they're real. I readily admit that people make demands and prescribe things, and that this is different, very different from stating facts, a factual state of affairs. However, it's the ground of those ethical prescriptions, those ought statements, which we're discussing, and it's that which I hold is subjective. And it does not require an objective ground to keep the distinction. The distinction, in the reverse, the distinction does not collapse if the ground is subjective. We only are noting that, at least in part, what accounts for the distinction, the real distinction, is a differing source. That is statements derive ultimately from the world, and ought statements derive ultimately from our construction in the pursuit of what we desire. This does not collapse the distinction between is and ought. I missed something. I really want to go over it. He spoke about this is going back to part 3. He spoke about the need for having the distinction between legitimate authority and good and just mere power. But we do not actually hold. I don't hold to the view that it's a mere power struggle. It's important to realize that the authority actually is legitimated within social institutions. Quite clearly, the social institution itself is the immediate ground of the legitimacy. If a cop, using that example, comes to pull you over, it's because he represents a social institution, that's law enforcement. And you accept his legitimacy because he has to enforce the traffic laws. But we create those social institutions. Thank you.
Mr. Graham, you're up.
Hello. Okay. I'm going to respond to Mr. Nadler's opening speech. First, I want to address his concern or his discussion on the difference between first and second order questions. I want to say that I agree with Mr. Nadler that we are discussing a second order question. That I definitely agree with. But that's pretty much where we part. Honestly, this is one of the most puzzling points that Mr. Nadler has made tonight, is that second order questions don't bear on first order questions. What would we say to a physicist who said, the physical world doesn't exist, but that doesn't have any bearing on my field of study? We would look at that person as if they were crazy. The reason is just because physics is the study of the material world insofar as it's in motion. If there is no world, then there is no study of the world. It just seems obvious that if we're going to talk about truth as any kind of correspondence to reality, that if the reality is taken away, so are the conclusions. If Mr. Nadler thinks that first-order consequences, or that there are no first-order consequences to his second-order view, then I think he's mistaken. If there is no objective basis for morality, then clearly there's logical implications on our first-order considerations. As Henry Veatch says in his book For an Ontology of Morals, take away the real or ontological ground for rightness and wrongness of an action, and there will no longer seem to be any proper reason for anyone holding it to be right or wrong. And without reasons for our moral judgments, we must acknowledge that such judgments are quite arbitrary. If someone adopts the notion that there is no objective basis for moral opinions and goes on to explain their moral view, we would think of them as at least disingenuous, if not outright deceptive, to go on and espouse some kind of moral view. Most people recognize this, and that's why they become psychologically distraught when they're told that their most deeply held convictions are not based in reality. Mackie knows this, and he reacts to this. He says, the denial of objective values can carry with it an extreme emotional reaction, and feeling that nothing matters at all, that life lost its purpose. The abandonment of belief in the objective values can cause, at least temporarily, a decay of subjective concern or sense of purpose. So Mr. Nadler would have you think that this distress comes by maybe indoctrination or dissatisfaction with this truth or something like that. I think it's a lot more reasonable to hold that reality has bearing on truth. And when you say that there really are no objective moral claims, that bears on my moral claims, such as it's wrong to kill people for fun. If there are no objective moral values, then it's just incongruous to go and then say it's wrong to kill people. If nothing's right or wrong, why do we pretend that some things are right or wrong? Another issue is this diversity of moral opinions. This is one of the arguments that he gives in favor of his view. He gives two arguments. One is the diversity of moral opinions implies, or that is best explained by subjectivism. And then two is the argument from strangeness or queerness. Queerness is what Mackie calls it. Mr. Nadler's first argument is based on the multiplicity of differing moral standards. However, the difference in moral standards are often exaggerated. As C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity notes, I know that some people say that the idea of a law of nature or decent behavior known to all men is unsound because different civilizations and different ages have had quite different moralities. But this is not true. There have been differences between moralities, but these differences have never amounted to anything like a total difference. If anyone will take the trouble to compare the moral teachings of, say, the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greeks, and Romans, what will really strike them is how very like they are to each other and to our own. So if Mr. Nadler wants to use the argument from divergent moral opinions, he has to show that these differences are not trivial differences. He needs to show that the differences between these moral positions are not trivial, and that these non-trivial differences are best explained by subjectivism. If Mr. Nadler doesn't recognize the similarities between moral systems, then perhaps we can talk about that later. However, I think the biggest problem for Mr. Nadler is that our debate concerns which view best explains moral facts, or explains the fact of moral experience. At a minimum, Mr. Nadler's view must take into account not only the differences in moral opinions, but the unity of moral opinions. It's not enough to just say that to account for the diversity of moral opinions. So, even if he does explain the diversity of moral opinions, he would still have to show, he would still have to explain morals that seem to transcend culture. Don't murder, don't lie, don't steal, those kinds of things. This would be a baseline requirement for a satisfactory theory, but actually he has to do even more than that. He doesn't have to just show that it's a satisfactory theory. He has to show that his theory is superior to rival objectivist theories. So let me just recount. First, he has to give the differences between the moral systems, or show that the differences between moral systems are not trivial. He needs to, two, show that these non-trivial differences are best explained by subjectivism. Three, how subjectivism explains the unity of moral experiences. And then finally, he needs to show how subjectivism as a whole explains the relevant data better than objectivism. And perhaps he can respond to that in his next rebuttal or in the Q&A session. The final argument, and this seems to be the heart of Mr. Nadler's argument, is this argument from queerness or strangeness. To be fair, I think this argument is actually a good argument against certain forms of objectivism. But Mr. Nadler's not argued against any one form of objectivism, but he rules out all forms of objectivism based on this argument. He offers two arguments that supposedly refute all forms of objectivism. The first one being moral facts, if they existed, would be very strange objects and that they would be prescriptive objects. But prescriptive objects are not consistent with the world as we observe it, so these objects, if they existed, would be inconsistent with the world as we observe it. That seems to be the summary of the first argument that he gave. Second being, objectivism must posit strange objects that tie facts to values. There is no natural explanation for a relation between facts and values, so objectivism must posit entities that are strange or metaphysically queer to explain the relation facts have to values. Before I respond to that, I want to give a quick quote from J.L. Mackie. He says, "But since moral skepticism is an error theory, since it goes against assumptions ingrained in our thought and built into some of the ways in which language is used, since it conflicts with what is sometimes called common sense, it needs a very solid support. It is not something we can accept lightly or casually and then quietly pass on. He then goes to give the same arguments that Mr. Nadler gave tonight, and both Mackie and Nadler do seem to think that these arguments are among the more strong arguments for subjectivism. But how strong really are these arguments? Well, first, Mr. Nadler supposes that if moral facts existed, they would have to be prescriptive objects. Since moral facts would have to be prescriptive objects, they would be queer and thus unreasonable entities to believe in. But this neglects to even consider any non-Platonic theories of moral objectivism. I, along with other natural law theorists, reject prescriptive objects as a basis for morality. I don't think that moral statements are true because they correspond to some prescriptive object. I find these objects to be queer as well. Rather, I find the basis for moral claims in the human essence. We are able to know what good is, not because our moral statements refer to some extramental prescriptive object, but because we know the human essence. The practical intellect knows, for example, knowledge is a good to be pursued by a simple act of non-inferential understanding. There is a sense in which what is good for us is built into us, so that we need not refer to some strange prescriptive object. Freud locates the basis for morals in instinct. Mr. Nadler locates, at least in the opening speech, seemed to indicate feeling and will as the basis. Natural law theorist offers a basis, human nature itself, and unless you're a radical existentialist, our human nature is not something that we create. So locating the basis for morals in human nature turns morals into something that we discover. Locating the basis for morals and feelings and will, maybe the shared feelings and will of a community.
Indeed.
And then it's something that we create. So I think that we have actually, I think that what said actually responds to both arguments from queerness, since not all objectivist theories are based on these prescriptive objects to ground their objectivism. So it doesn't follow that a rejection of prescriptive objects entails a rejection of objectivism as such. The second argument from queerness doesn't add weight to the first argument because I've denied that any such prescriptive objects exist. And if no prescriptive objects exist, then I don't need to posit any entity to account for the relationship between facts and values. Thus, I see no need to rule out all forms of objectivism based on the arguments from queerness.
In this next section, we'll have the cross-examination. I'll have both debaters bring their chairs in front of their tables. I'll move the podium so they can ask each other questions directly. The first questions will be asked by Matt Graham. He can ask as many questions as he wants in succession. He can wait for Mr. Nadler to answer the questions or not. But according to the rules, Mr. Nadler's not able to ask any questions of Mr. Graham for this first 5 minutes. Then after that, the rules will be reversed.
Hey, Chris, since we need to write, can you stay behind the tables?
They're going to stay behind the tables.
It's hard to write. Okay. So, Mr. Nadler, why do you think that second-order questions don't... Well, first of all, do you think that second-order questions have any bearing on first-order questions?
Thank you for the question. To explain, second-order questions refer to the grounds of morality that I was referring to. First-order questions refer to the content. I do believe that there can be bearing of second-order questions on first-order questions, that the grounds may have some bearing. But I think it begs the question to say that second-order questions, that is, the grounds, determine a particular content.
What about, say, for example, in physics? Would you say that to say that the world does not exist, and then to go and say that I am a physicist who studies the physical objects, is that inconsistent?
Well, not if you're an idealist. I think that now it would seem strange, obviously, to someone coming from different presuppositions, but there are people who are positivists. There are people who are idealists who believe that the job of science is not to establish the existence of a physical world, which may or may not exist. They may think that's even an uninteresting question, but rather the existence of a physical world is irrelevant to what they're doing, which is science in the first order, that is, they're establishing the content of science
And
through experiment.
In the context of morals, is it ever relevant or never?
Is what never relevant?
The second order question, or second order questions, are they ever relevant to first order questions in a moral context?
I believe they are relevant.
Okay. Why must moral facts be queer entities?
For the reasons I gave, because they're queer entities because there's nothing that they correspond to in the natural world.
Okay. How about, do you recognize the fact that other objectivist theories, particularly in the natural law tradition, don't accept prescriptive objects as a basis for their moral claims as well? Do you accept that?
But they don't accept it?
Yeah.
I accept that they don't accept it. I think they are actually positing a queer entity, though.
Okay, but do you agree that they don't give the same Platonic account for
That's
moral?
true. That's
Okay.
true. They give an Aristotelian account, which is mainly Platonic in nature. I mean, it brings the form down to the natural world,
Okay,
but the human essence still seems to be.
Okay, because your argument seems to rely on the fact that that these objects must be this way. They must be prescriptive objects, likened to universals in a Neoplatonist sense. You're admitting, right, that that's not the only account that objectivists give in order to ground objective morality, right?
That's not the only opinion that they may have of their own view. In other words, I understand that you don't think that your account posits a queer entity.
Okay.
But I don't think that it succeeds in positing a natural entity. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
I'm not allowed to ask questions.
Also, how do you explain on your account why, for example, I didn't quite understand your explanation of how you ground the is-ought distinction, or how you can continue to hold the is-ought distinction even if there's no ground. Could you explain that?
The is-ought, there's a real distinction in the way people make statements. And that's, I mean, if we take as what's self-evident about the is-ought distinction is that one statement is indicative, another statement is prescriptive, that you're saying someone ought to do something, and that's a real difference.
Okay, how do you explain that people have a sense of obligation even in the absence of social pressure?
People have an obligation in the absence of social pressure because they are self-motivated to have that in that case. There's at least 3 levels of universalization that they may go through, in which case in which they usually they're accepting the obligations which they've received, but in the absence of social pressure, they may accept those obligations, and they can confirm them, at least possibly. We can construct an account where they're confirming them through universalization.
Okay. And also, you said that my response, or my characterization of your view was false in that I said that only feelings account for
That's
morals. If it's not just feelings, could you explain maybe a little bit more about what they are? What else accounts for them?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. In the primordial sense, that is, in what they
You
come
can finish
from,
answering.
they are accounted for in terms of, boy, that went fast. In terms of both sentiment, that is feelings, and will, that is your wants, your needs, which are perhaps more primary. Now, I'm not able to give even a full sketch of that kind of view, but on the primordial level. But when we get to when moral values are already objectified in cultures, it's too late for that in a sense. It's too late to now allow your feelings to determine things. Now we're dealing with traditions that we've received.
Mr. Nadler, you can start asking questions.
Oh, wow. Okay. Is it okay that I have my Mac here? It's a rhetorical
No.
question. No. How do you define natural law? Because I understand there's different definitions for it.
Right. I would just, generically speaking, I would just say that there is a law of nature and that there is a prescriptivity built into nature that we can know.
Okay. Do you consider infanticide to be a significant issue, moral issue,
Yes.
upon which cultures disagree? Okay. Oh. I need to go to law school. That's a statement. You're not allowed to give statements. Okay.
Ought to go.
Often people speak of their inclinations, but which refer to different things. On what grounds do you proffer an objective inclination in human nature?
On what grounds do I? Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Can I give an example to make the question more sensible, because it's unintelligible at this point? Not all people are theists, for example. Not all people find the goal-directedness of their life in God, or not all people find fulfillment or happiness in, say, a life of contemplating divine things or pursuing something like that. People have different ends, in other words. On what grounds, then, do we offer an objective inclination? That is, in light of the fact that people have different inclinations.
We know that people have inclinations towards things when, because we can, well, given my metaphysics, I think that a thing's activities tells us about what something is. So when I observe that everyone has an inclination to do something, say, make moral judgments about things and evaluate the world morally, from that I would say that that's because humans have a moral inclination, have a natural moral inclination towards that. They can't help not doing that.
Okay. Can you give a quick definition on human nature? What is human nature? I know that sounds strange, but...
No, well, I mean, the definition of what humans are is rational animals, but...
Okay.
Is that what you're asking, or are you asking something different than that?
Okay, if that's your answer, rational animals.
That's what you're saying.
I'm trying to think, see if I have anything else here. In what sense are rational animals, is there an inclination in rational animals that can be observed or discovered?
Well, in the sense that we observe the activity of that being, namely of the humans, we observe the activities of them being unable to avoid making moral judgments in our case. But naturally speaking, we grow because that's what our nature determines us to do, is to grow. So we know by way of observation, and then we say that that's true. That's true of what that being is. Like, I mean, that's not probably a very good. Is there a clarification question? Or?
No, that's actually. Thank you.
Right. Do you want extra time to formulate your second rebuttals?
Oh.
Or do you just want to go ahead?
I'll go ahead. The main thing I'm discovering from these questions is that it doesn't seem to be.
Wait a second.
Oh, sorry.
I got to get the podium up here.
Oh, I got to do it in the podium. Feels so official. Can I use both microphones? No. Okay. What I'm discovering from these rebuttals is that there does not seem to be a non-queer, if you will, account for the objects in question, for what it is that's supposed to be objective. I am still at a loss to understand what it is that we're talking about when we talk about human essences, talk about human natures in terms of their directed content. When I observe the world, I see different kinds of people. I see people behaving differently, having different ends, different goals. And there's also unity, but I don't consider that unity to imply any sort of uniformity of nature. And I just don't see where that's established. And so I think the argument from queerness still holds, and I don't think it's actually been defeated. And there has to be an account for the objective value that it somehow prescribes itself, and also that has the ought contained naturally in the world, which is not forthcoming. And that's it. Okay.
let's see. I think one of the common elements here for it seems that Mr. Nadler is getting at is that, one, is it's difficult to locate some kind of explanation for something that even he and Mr. Mackie recognize, is that people see or think that morals are objective, and we act this way all the time. Since Mr. Nadler can't seem to find some kind of feature of reality to which these things correspond, he concludes that there isn't one. But I just disagree. I think that Mr. Nadler presupposes this sort of Platonic view, in that there has to be these objects that are universal, that are prescriptive objects, and that sort of thing to which they refer. Otherwise, no account is satisfying to him. But, I mean, there are a lot of other accounts that need to be taken into consideration. And just because he doesn't understand what an essence is, it doesn't follow that objectivism is false. That may just be a claim of ignorance. In order for us to say that it rules out, or these things are also queer, he needs to give an argument for that, a reason for why these things are queer. But when I talk about the human essence, this is something that's had something of a continuity in ancient and medieval philosophy. It's not hidden as what human essence means and what it is. And Mr. Nadler also knows that I tend towards some kind of Thomism, and he's more than able to study what that means and have some understanding of what it is. I'd like to make another comment here on the second order questions. Frankly, I just think this is false. And it's not the case, for example, that idealists don't think second order questions have bearing on first order questions. Even Immanuel Kant, Kantian idealism, thought that second order questions had bearing on first order questions. He didn't say that you could just go ahead and make any first order statement that you want and have no basis for it. That was, in fact, his project. His project was, how is it that synthetic a priori statements can be true? And he goes and builds this elaborate second order theory in order to establish that we can, in fact, make synthetic a priori statements. So maybe he can offer some kind of specific idealist that he says, or that doesn't think that second order questions have bear on first order questions. He questions my argument here. He thinks I'm mischaracterizing him when I say that morals are derived from just feelings, and then he appeals to like family history and that sort of thing. Well, this seems to be just sort of an aggregation of a lot of feelings. There's got to be something qualitatively different to give as an explanation. Otherwise, it just seems like it is still reducible to feelings as an explanation. Not only that, we recognize, contrary to what the subjectivist holds, that the statement, Jesus is a good man, is not identical with I like Jesus. Even Mr. Nadler holds this. So how do we get from one to the other? I like Jesus too, good man. He says that we universalize our feelings, but to me that's just an assertion. Like we have, as realists, we have explanations for these things that are grounded ultimately in our metaphysics, in our epistemology, and maybe we can get more into that. Let's see. Oh, he questioned how I argue for the objectivity by an inference to the best explanation. He says that requires a criteria. Well, yeah, I mean, it requires the same criteria that every inference, like every kind of theory like that requires. Explanatory scope and power. Have I explained all of the relevant data? Is it ad hoc? If it's ad hoc, if it doesn't explain the relevant data, it doesn't have explanatory power, well then, yeah, it's not a good theory. That's what I'm accusing him of. I don't think he's given a theory that accounts for all of the relevant data. So that would be my criteria for that. And I think that's all for now. I'll wait till our next speech.
You can take a moment to prepare for your closing statement and start when you're ready. Mr. Graham first.
I forgot about that. Okay, well, again, I'd like to thank Mr. Nadler, and I'd like to thank the Philosophy Club for having us do this debate tonight. It's been an enjoyable experience. I framed this debate tonight so that each of us needs to look at the fact of moral experience and give the best explanation for that. Mr. Nadler's agreed with several of my points. He's agreed that there is a fact of moral experience. He's also agreed, at least for the most part, that the inference to the best explanation is a better route to take than other possible routes. And I've answered the question as to what kind of criteria that needs to be set forth in order to make an inference to the best explanation. What I'd like to say tonight is that if you look back, like as C.S. Lewis has said, if you look at the world as it is, it's just a lot more. This view explains what's going on. I mean, we have Jewish sources, we have Greek sources, we have Indian sources, we have Hindu sources, Babylonian sources, all saying similar things about what's right and what's wrong. There is a commonality between the basic moral principles. And as an objectivist, we can account for the unity and the diversity, that there is a core set of objective principles, which accounts for the unity. What accounts for the diversity is that we make mistakes. I make mistakes in mathematics, but that doesn't mean that mathematics is somehow not objectively true. 2 + 2 = 4. I make logical errors, but that's why we study logic. We study logic so that we can become better at it and make better inferences. Well, this is what I think this is analogous to morals. Is that yeah, we have some kind of objective basis. Or objective principles, but we don't always make the right inferences. Sometimes it's because we don't have all the facts. Sometimes it's because we don't clearly understand the moral principles or values. So it explains that. It explains all of a number of other facts that we have here, like a moral obligation, why I feel guilty in the absence of social pressure. It's just, I guess I'll have to just leave it up to you guys to decide whether or not you think that his explanation is a satisfactory explanation. And how do you do that? Well, does it accord with what you experience when you feel guilt? Does his explanation actually explain what happens when that happens to you? It's my contention that it doesn't. Finally, I'd like to just, again, say that if Mr. Nadler wants to have a satisfactory theory, simplicity need not be the criteria. For example, if you get into particle or actually cellular division or something like that, simplicity of a theory is not a good criteria for the soundness of a theory. Because you could have a simple theory of a cell dividing or something like that by saying, oh, well, once it gets real big, it kind of pops and then the two grow back together again. Well, the actual theory is much more complicated than that, and it's true. It's been scientifically shown to be true, that there's all sorts of molecular machines and that sort of thing that account for cellular division. So simplicity is, again, that's not a good criteria. I would just ask you guys also to look at objectivism, to fully understand it before you reject it and go off into subjectivism. Thank you guys for your time.
I echo those thanks. I really had a lot of fun tonight, and I hope to have more fun with tough questions from y'all. I actually still haven't. I'm still not clear on the criteria. I understand explanatory scope. I understand power. To me, those things seem to be saying the same thing as how well does it explain the relevant data. I'm looking for criteria as to the means of explaining the data. And as far as I can tell, Occam's razor it does come into play here. Simplicity actually does give us a view as to what might be the better theory. And by the way, Occam's razor, I'm in no way a full professor or even a partial, but from what I understand, Occam's razor is that the simplest explanation that covers the necessary data. And so what I'd leave you with is whether my theory has actually done that. I believe it has. And it's certainly more simple than the objectivist account. He's positing, he has to posit human nature, which is not observed, and I understand it has a tradition to it too, but then so does ethics, and we're here debating whether ethics is objective or subjective. So, but the questions then still remain. And so my arguments, to sum up, were that divergent moralities seem to stem from differing ways of life, not a common nature, and I think not a common law, rather. And I think I showed that. As for the differences, that it covers off on that. As for the unity, that is very important, but at the same time, I don't think there's a whole lot that needs to be explained there, because you simply have people growing up in similar circumstances, and we are facing similar problems, that is scarcity of resources, and so we create similar ethics to handle those problems. So I suppose I didn't. He has a very good point that I didn't touch on that in my opening statement, but it does seem like that's handled. But with objectivism, there still is this problem of a particularly strange object that needs to be explained, and so I do leave it to you as well, and I also leave ethics to you. I think you're responsible to create ethics and to create a society as you understand it. And thank you.
Now we have the audience question and answer time. During this time, I ask you to please form a line down the center aisle. I'll hand the microphone to the person with the first question, and when that person is done, they can hand the microphone back to the person behind them. If no one has a question, or if people are stalling, then I'll hold the microphone for you so you're not stuck in the center of the aisle. Remember, when you ask your question, to please tell or say to whom you're directing the question. Please limit your preface to your question to a maximum of 3 sentences so as to not generate any sort of sermons here. And then please get straight to your question.
Are they both going to be answering each question, or do we just direct them?
You can direct, and that person has 3 minutes to respond.
Okay, so they're not both going to answer the question?
Right.
Okay. Mr. Nadler, I became somewhat confused during the debate because my understanding of objective versus subjective morality has to do with whether the moral agent himself is the ground for a statement versus there being some kind of transcendent law that he's referring to. But you seem to both be arguing for some kind of transcendent universal, maybe not universal, sorry, some kind of transcendent law that can be referred to, but you're just grounding it in a different place. So for example, during the Q&A, you actually said that morals become objectified by society. So is it the case that you're just arguing for limited objective morals and not universal, instead of actually arguing for true subjective morality?
It's a very good question, and unfortunately, not all semantical distinctions can be made in a 2-hour period. James Rachel's, he wrote Elements of Moral Philosophy, which actually was my textbook in college. But he makes the distinction between simple subjectivism and more robust forms of subjectivism. And simple subjectivism would be where personal preference is all that is expressed by a subjective statement. But other forms of subjectivism find grounding for moral values that have made its way into culture and are sort of and are objective in their own sense, a sort of limited sense, like you say. But their derivation is subjective. Their grounding is subjective. So that's a very important distinction. I'm not merely saying, for example, that Jesus is a good man means I like Jesus. I actually think that's false. I don't think it means I like Jesus. I think you're actually making a statement which purports to much more than that. And within the society and culture, I think it has meaning, has real meaning, beyond just personal preference. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
My question is for Mr. Graham. You claim that morals are grounded in some universal, objective human nature or human essence, which is prescriptive in nature. Can you explain the difference between that and a prescriptive object whose existence you deny?
Yeah, a prescriptive object that, at least according to my understanding, is like a principle. In contemporary realism, when you talk about universals, there are entities that exist that account for concrete particulars. Like, for example, this table's red, that table's red. There's some, in a Platonic sort of sense, there's this third thing that accounts for the redness in both things. It's an entity that exists not as a particular, but as a universal. What it seems like Mr. Nadler is doing is saying that, well, in order to account for example, moral predicates, Jesus is good, the predicate good, has to refer to some queer entity that's along those lines. And I just reject that. I don't think any of those kinds of things exist. So the human essence, and again, it's a lot more complicated than this, but to say is universal in my mind, but particular in reality. Like I have a particular human essence that is universal in my mind. So, I mean, it's a completely different metaphysical starting point. It's not. It seemed like Mr. Nadler was trying to say that those two are not that far apart. They really are. They're very different. In fact, well, yeah, they're very different.
My question's for Mr. Nadler. I'm going to follow up with that, actually. You made the statement during the cross-examination that the different ideas, the hylomorphic idea versus the Platonic idealist idea, are not that far apart. Obviously, there are some differences. So what I wanted to ask you is, what are the shared characteristics of Platonic idealism and hylomorphism that you use in your assertion that cause both to be invoking a queer entity?
Well, that's a good question. I think Aristotle's account also posits a form. He just puts it someplace else. And so there's, in that sense, the relationship between form and matter in Aristotle is far from clear. I mean, we've been debating it for millennia afterward. And so modern science just doesn't accept it. I mean, we don't use those sorts of distinctions. We don't use those sorts of categories. And so, again, I know it seems like I'm pleading ignorance here, and it may be, in a sense, I am pleading ignorance of medieval theology, but it's hopefully a learned ignorance. Science just doesn't do that. I mean, we don't know how to. Those are queer entities. But again, the common characteristic between the two is that it's positing a form. It's just with Aristotle, it's a form of that is the human nature itself, individualized or concretized in some way. But beyond that, I don't exactly know how to answer the question, because they both seem deeply strange when we look at the world around us.
That modern science does not accept the idea of forms is your shared characteristic?
No, but that they both posit a form of the being, and that those things aren't observed. And modern science doesn't accept those things because they just haven't been useful in producing science. I mean, they just haven't been useful in doing work, but that's because they haven't been observable. They haven't been seen. And so it's that on that basis, because I don't know what they are, that I have to posit them as queer entities. Strange.
This is for Mr. Nadler as well. Humans seem to get all knowledge from experience in some way. Like we can't make up a brand new color or a brand new physical property or something just radically other than what we experience. But you've also granted Mr. Graham's point that we use prescriptive language. And so my question is, how do you explain the very idea of ought and should? Mr. Graham says that it's objective. You say it's subjective, but you still have just as queer of an entity in explaining the use of that language as Mr. Graham does in grounding it somewhere in reality. So how do you explain the queerness of the use of the radically different ideas of should and ought?
I don't think it's queer, and I do think it's observed to place demands on other individuals. And you place demands in light of your own interests. And
But demand is saying I want. That's very different than saying should or ought.
right, but it's developed from those demands.
But you said yourself that they're radically different. Is and ought are radically different. You can't get ought from demand, from an is.
Can you get want from demand?
Yeah, want is just a desire. That's an is.
Well, I think there is a desire for something else that's not necessarily posited there. So, anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but
My question is where does the very idea of should come from?
right, humans actually need certain things, and so they formulate their oughts, if you will, on the basis of those needs.
Can you give a concrete example of how that would happen?
Right. You're in an environment with limited resources, like there's just not enough food to go around, but you want to be able to eat, and so you share, and it becomes normal for the culture to say that we should share. Is that concrete? Or?
Yeah, I just don't think you've explained exactly how you go from should is such a radically different thing. I don't think you've explained how that really comes about.
It is in meaning, yeah, but in terms of what it refers to, it's different. It's the same. So.
Mr. Nadler, I don't envy you your all your preparation and your discussions. It's been great. In thinking about
Also, Mr. Graham.
I'm sorry, Ms. Nadler.
Okay.
In thinking about this issue of morality, if I look at the natural world and the animal world, I don't see any moral characteristics in nature other than humanity. Would you grant that that is an objective statement?
The statement itself.
That mankind is the only moral creature on Earth?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think if you look at populations of primates, for example, they care for one another, or at least seem to care for one another, which is what we all tend to consider the most basic
Do they
elements
have
of
a court
morality.
of justice?
What?
Do they ask moral questions? Do they have a court of
No,
justice?
they don't necessarily ask moral questions. I don't know. I'm not a primatologist, so, but well, I mean, it's certainly a fair question, and it may be the case that they don't have a good concept of justice. But empathy, if empathy is the basis of morality, or if empathy is a starting point for how we're constructing morality, then I think we see that in populations of higher primates.
And I would contend that human morality is objective, and that it is not visible in the animal world. And it seems like the discussion that's going on tonight is the next order. Okay, what if morality is, then which moral things should we follow after? And because we haven't answered that question, we say we can't know, and you just throw the whole thing out. I contend that we all can see that mankind is a moral creature, and that's pretty radically different than the animal kingdom. And we just, from that point on, we disregard that fact and then continue on in our merry way with skepticism and just cloud the issue. So I was going to press you, I guess, on the issue that man is a moral creature objectively. So.
Thank you both for coming tonight. Mr. Nadler, you seem to have presupposed that it can be that this object of morality can be observed scientifically, or it's queer. It's either scientifically observed, physically observed. What type of non-physical, metaphysical reality would you accept as a ground for morality that you would not consider queer, or is it simply empirically observable, or it doesn't exist?
Yeah, I definitely accept personal sentiment and will, that is subjective human activity, if you will, as a grounds for morality. And I think I think an important point that needs to be made is that it's a real grounds. It's not just, I'm not just saying, oh, now morality doesn't matter or it's not important. You gave that quote earlier from Mackie, where he talks about the difficult feelings that people go through when they realize that morality is subjective. But I think that wasn't the end of the road for Mackie, or he wasn't describing it as the end of the road for individuals, because there is a realization that when morality is grounded subjectively, it actually it leads to a more profound sense of responsibility for one's actions. But anyway, I'm sorry, that was a tangent. Did that answer your main question? Or? Okay.
Well,
right.
I had another question for Mr. Nadler, but I'm going to let Mr. Graham have one, give you a little break, get some water. Mr. Graham,
Yes, Mr. Beaumont?
Mr. Nadler has grounded morals in society, family, religion, these sorts of social institutions. And I think it seems to be the case that we do learn some of our morals, at least, from those institutions, what side of the road to drive on, whether or not you should pull out a chair for a lady, that sort of thing. Would you say that there's any morals that cannot be accounted for, given Mr. Nadler's explanation? Are there some morals that cannot be accounted for simply by the fact that society teaches people that that's the way it should be? And if that's the case, doesn't that undercut all of your major arguments?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, if we learned them that way, especially like if Aristotle's right, we do learn them that way, but that doesn't mean that they're not objective. I don't think it does undercut it. For example, we learn all of our our mathematical. All of our mathematical skills are usually learned under some kind of tutorage or something like that. But even if I can account for all of my mathematical knowledge by my upbringing, it doesn't follow that they're not objective. Same way with logic. I mean, even if the law of non-contradiction, I used the law of non-contradiction growing up, but I wasn't taught the law of non-contradiction until I was in college. Like formally, explained what it is that a lot of these things that we know by inclination, and then later on we're able to reflect on them and elucidate them and make them more clear, that sort of thing. But to answer your question, no, I don't know that there's any moral principles that we can account for that we haven't actually learned. But I don't think that undercuts my argument.
My question, sir, Mr. Graham, as well. The universal human essence you stated is only universal in concept, not in particular. That being the case, do you believe that this human essence is reason enough by itself to posit objective morality? And I have a follow-up for that.
Right, and I'm not saying I'm positing objective morality. I'm saying that based on what we know about the human essence, it is the ground for morality. I'm not trying to say I'm positing this. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is that our knowledge of us as human beings is not limited. Even if science is limited, it's not. Our knowledge holistically is not limited to just our physicality. Like we have a more robust knowledge of humans than that. And it's in that greater knowledge that we recognize that there are certain ways that human beings ought to be. For example, maybe an analogous way of stating this would be, if you have somebody with an arm that's cut off, or not cut off, but they're kind of deformed, we recognize that that's not the way it ought to have been. Why? Well, because we know humans ought to have fully developed arms. We have or a leg or something like that. Or if my mind doesn't work, say I have some kind of mental deformity or something like that. We know that that's unnatural, that's a deficiency of human nature in some sense. I mean, sorry to those who would think that that's like politically incorrect, but that's true. Like if human beings ought to naturally have arms and legs and eyes and think clearly and that sort of thing. So it's sort of analogous to that. We also know what human beings are and do, and we also know what they ought to do. from that.
So to clarify, you are saying that this individualized human essence is reason enough to explain or account for objective morality.
Well, it's not in itself fully explanatory. I think ultimately you have to argue that our nature was pointed in a particular direction by a supernatural being. Because we don't, I mean, I'm not an existentialist. I think our natures determine us, not we determine our nature. And if that's the case, it's something other than us had to create our nature, which I think is God. So God ultimately is responsible for ethics and right and wrong morality. But the epistemic grounds is human nature. We know by observing humans what they are, what they should be, that kind of thing.
So would you agree then that if that individualized human essence were the only ground for your argument, it seems that if that is the case, it's very similar to what Mr. Nadler is talking about in terms of human societies forming on the basis of a consensus of their individuals some sort of moral framework. So even if you took the human race as a whole, as a society, as Mr. Nadler is talking about, that would not be, and they all decided there was a consensus of some moral, objective morality, they could still be misguided.
Yeah, right. But I'm not locating the basis for morals in feeling or will or anything that's a result of our acting. I'm locating it as something that we don't have any real say-so in the matter. My nature, I don't make that. I don't create that. That's objective. That's something that's determined by nature and ultimately God. God creates our nature. We recognize from that there are certain ways that humans ought to be and certain ways that they ought not to be.
So if it isn't, though, in the actions of the individuals, in what sense is this human essence that you are positing, in what sense is it observable?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
You're saying that you aren't specifically referring to human activity. If you aren't referring to human activity, in what sense is that the human essence that you're using to substantiate your claim for objectivity and morals, in what sense is it observable?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry, I just don't understand the question. Okay, I'm sorry.
I think, I mean, to be fair, I think you answered it with respect to a different question. So maybe, if I could, I think you were saying something about the activities are the evidence for something. So it's sort of like something unseen, but the activities, the functions, maybe that kind of thing. Is that I was just listening. I don't know if that's.
Well, yeah, and that's part of the reason I gave the analogy of the people with shriveled hands and stuff like that. It's something analogous to that. It's analogous to, we know that humans ought to have such and such, arms, legs, eyes, that kind of thing. We also know that things that are truly good for them and truly privation of that good.
My question is for Mr. Graham. If you believe that morals are objective, then how would you explain different moral practices that have changed throughout history, like slavery, multiple marriages to multiple women, etc.?
Error. Basically, I would say that I'm not saying, for example, that morality is always clear. I'm saying that there are certain basic moral principles that are more clear. Like, for example, I go out and talk with teachers and that kind of thing, and I'll ask them, do you think homosexuality is wrong? Oh, no, that's just a matter of opinion. Do you think torturing babies for fun is wrong? Oh, yeah, of course. Well, they're both prescriptive claims, and one of them they're absolutely certain on, and another they're not. And I think the reason for that is some moral principles are more obvious than others. Some are maybe, derivable from others, less basic than others. And not only that, when we think rationally about morality, we engage in what's called a practical syllogism. So I can be wrong perhaps maybe in the moral principle, but I might also be wrong in the matter of fact. C.S. Lewis uses a good example about witches and being burnt at the stake. He says that people, like particularly subjectivists, will say, well, we've advanced morally because we used to burn witches at the stake. And his response is that, well, there's no moral advantage because we don't think witches exist. We don't think that these evil creatures that go around and put spells on people exist. So there's no moral advantage in not killing them. Because if they did do that sort of thing, we would think, even today, we would think that it's okay to kill them because they're going around and doing evil things to people. So there's the issue of the clarity of certain moral principles, and there's also the issue of the facts of the matter. Like we might be wrong about the facts. Does that make sense, or is that?
Somewhat, but if you're saying certain moral principles aren't clear, is that what you're saying?
Well, I should say, yeah, or certain applications of moral principles, like what constitutes like a violation of justice or something like that. You have to kind of get a little more granular in your description of what the moral principle is, more specific about it, and then how it necessarily applies to that situation. And that's sometimes unclear.
Thank you.
My questions are for Mr. Nadler, and you guys both did a great job, by the way. Mr. Nadler, I have one clarification question. You seem to say that when someone says Jesus was a good man, you said it doesn't reduce to I like Jesus. There's a more cultural, social element to it, but you also seem to say that reduces to individual subjectivity in some way. Could you explain that?
I could try. I think I probably misspoke in both of those. But by the way you've just restated what I said, I must have misspoken in both of those circumstances. Let me try to state it correctly now. I actually think that that the statement, Jesus is a good man, does purport to predicate something of Jesus, as we actually agree. I just think it is an error. It presumes an error on the part of the person stating making the statement as to its grounds. And so, in other words, if, for example, someone is making it with the assumption that has objective import, that kind of predication, they're making a mistake. So I find it ironic a little bit that in the end we both seem to hold to an error theory of sorts. Just it's very different where we place the errors. You place it in terms of certain behaviors of cultures, whereas I seem to for me it's often linguistic, the errors people make. What was the other part of the question, or there wasn't?
So what does it mean when I say Jesus was a good man? What do I actually mean by that, so I'm not mistaken?
Well, that's a pretty tough question. Most ethical theorists devote some chapter of their book to the meaning of the term good, but I offer a preliminary meaning of the term good as meeting a certain set of standards. The standards, when we judge things by a standard, we can call it objective in a sense, but most standards are created. Like we create weights and measurements, for example. Standards of sort of grading. All these things are created, so they're subjectively derived, but they obviously within those standards they can be objective. So if a cutting knife meets certain standards for cutting well or doing its job, it's a good cutting knife. Jesus is a good man if he meets the standards one is set for what it means to be a man, I guess. And the opposite also for Hitler.
Okay.
Right.
When you were responding to Mr. Graham's distinction between power and authority, you said the reason that we accept the police officer's demands is because he's granted that authority by a social institution.
That was what I said?
I think so.
I'll hold to that.
All right. How do you adjudicate between two social institutions which disagree morally? So, for instance, Canada's government decides that it's okay to kill Americans, and America's government decides it's not okay. Is there a moral way to answer that, or how would you explain that?
That's interesting, because there's a number of things involved there. It's how do I do it would involve a multi-step process, I suppose. One, I check with my morality. I mean, to me, it seems rather obvious that Canada is doing something wrong, and I don't have any qualms about saying they did something. Stop it, Canada, especially because they're Canadian. But but I mean, on the other hand, I don't think that necessitates an objective ground. That's where we differ. It's not in that we feel that I feel people don't have the right to say something's wrong. And well, how do I do that is complex, though. One, I admit that I've received a lot of the ways I think from my parents, from tradition. But again, I think to bar social pressure, I think it's okay to remove that and to consider how would it work if I was to try to reason through these things subjectively. I mean, reason through the situation in terms of my wants, in terms of being able to universalize my wants, because I see other individuals out there who seem to also have wants, and I can think about what might they want. It may not be exactly in the same way that that Jesus said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." It may be more, "Do unto others, don't do unto others necessarily as you would have them do unto you." Take into account taste. That's a rough translation of George Bernard Shaw's version of the Golden Rule, but taking into account taste, I think I would be able to conclude that Canada shouldn't kill us.
Thanks.
Yeah.
This question is also for Mr. Nadler. I wanted to ask you a question about where you say the diversity of morals out there seems to support your view. And there's a book called Peace Child. It was written by a missionary, and he worked with, I don't know if you're familiar with that one. He worked with a very remote tribe in like New Guinea or something like that. And what was really interesting in that culture, cannibalism was actually practiced, and that was considered a good thing by that culture. Mm-hmm. And they would go through these elaborate things where they would meet a member of the other tribe, act like they were friends, and then the highest virtue was to betray that person and then eventually eat them. Oh. What's interesting, however, is after they would do this cannibalism, which was, accepted by the whole tribe and even other tribes in the area that would do it to each other, mm-hmm. they would have elaborate cleansing, propitiation rites, almost like on a deep, deep level. They knew that there was something wrong with what they were doing. How do you explain that on your view?
Which part?
How do you explain not just obviously the cannibalism could be, from the objectivist view, a degenerate moral, or they're suppressing something. How would the subjectivist view explain that deeply held moral feeling that there was something wrong that they were doing if society just creates what's right and wrong? And the society is just saying, well, it's okay to be cannibalistic, that's what we do. How do you explain that opposite deep-seated urge that, no, there is something wrong, even though our society says it's okay to do it?
Well, it's not a fair transaction, they'd probably say. I mean, it seems that when I say fair, by the way, I'm not meaning not adhering to a form of justice out there in the cosmos somewhere. I'm saying that it's not tit for tat. And so this is to explain the final part. That when someone participates in that, the culture seems to be recognizing that that an equal transaction hasn't taken place. And so they perform rites to, I suppose, make up for that. That's just those seem to be the natural facts of what's going on. And eventually it develops the idea that maybe we ought not to do those things. Now, for me, it's just so offensive, the idea that they would, cannibalism. And so I can't account for why they would practice cannibalism. I don't. To me, it's for me, those sorts of things, being obviously a Western child, it's on par with Inuit practices of infanticide and those sorts of things.
Well, the idea that it's not being fair, is that something their society is just making up, or is that something deeply held that they know? Well, we're breaking a deeply held rule that's not fair.
Yeah,
that's it for tat.
No, I think we there's two things we can confuse. I don't mean not fair. I don't mean not fair in some sort of in the sense of there's no justice. I mean, well, it can be said that way, But I just mean the descriptive fact that there's not an equal transaction taking place.
Right, but saying
someone's being eaten alive, and there's no. It's hard to see what. In other words, it seems like something you then want to make up for, in some way, than to do something else.
And then the idea that you need to equalize things, is that just made up by their culture, or is that something deeper?
No, I mean it makes sense to want to equalize things, for things to be fair. I don't. I mean, does I think it's the thing that the idea that we ought to equalize things. Cultures have the tendency to make that up for very good reasons. I hold to an idea of social contract. The idea is that we want certain things, and we want to be able to. Justice makes the world go round. I mean, you're just not going to be able to have societies function without social contracts, and so that's where I'm deriving my idea from. It's not. Do they make it up? Of course, in terms of moral value, but it's a evaluation. Things should be fair. That doesn't mean it's a fact. The fact that this is unfair, in the sense I'm using the word unfair, isn't still objectively part of the world. Does that make sense? Of course it didn't.
My question's to Mr. Nadler.
Yeah.
If you agree that morals are derived from various cultures, what would be the basis for an institution like the United Nations? How do they, if different cultures arrive at different conclusions concerning ethical questions, what would be the basis for their consensus? And secondly, even if that was to be the case, what would prevent a universal government, so to say, from arriving at a position in the future, so to say, where the bayoneting of pregnant mothers would be something that would be socially acceptable?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the what?
The bayoneting of pregnant mothers would be socially acceptable.
What would prevent?
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out which question to take first. Let me take the first one first. Unity, the same way I tried to attempt an explanation, even though I didn't argue for it in my opening statement, an explanation for the unity between cultures is the same way I would offer an explanation for how things like the UN exist and work. They don't really work, but they do their best, right? But yeah, because there's common interests between different cultures, just as there's common interests between different people, and so those common interests are what forge the basis for the UN. What prevents, and those common interests, I think, prevent the bayoneting of women, of pregnant mothers, in general. It doesn't always, which is unfortunate to me. I feel very strongly about that.
So would you agree then that there could come an occasion where there could be a situation in the future where the consensus could be that which was decreed to be immoral now could in the future be a moral action?
Well, now you're asking a very general question. I certainly do think that, just because of what history's taught me, things which were considered moral or immoral in the past are no longer considered that. Bayoneting mothers seems very improbable just because, for a number of reasons. But we're talking about society as a whole, all interests. Similar things obviously happened within the Nazi government, but I don't see it as a likely thing to happen from all societies. I don't think the subjectivization of morality will lead to that, because again, someone could have an objective morality where, even though it seems unlikely to both of us, that bayoneting mothers is a norm, if you will, or should be done. Say if you held the view that life just isn't worth living, so you should bayonet expecting mothers. You could be an objective nihilist, I suppose, in that sense, metaphysically. So.
This question is for Mr. Nadler. It's about, seems like you think that morality is something that is only acquired by you being around the community. It's not something that is you are born with it. So we go to this matter of conscience, how you explain children that are growing and they have never been they never had any exposure to violence or culture, how you explain how they are evil, hitting other kids, and if they have never seen something like that. So how you explain if your morality is based on culture. If this person is raised, this kid never seen violence, no know what is that all about, but suddenly he's hit his mother or his brother. How you explain that then?